introduce to you our panel. We have the CEO of ADNOC LNG. I'm absolutely delighted to have with us Fatima and Nuaimi. Lovely to see you, Fatima. Thanks for being here. The CEO of Kuwait Foreign Petroleum Exploration Company, KUFPEC, is also with us, Sheikh Nawaf Al Sabah. Lovely to see you. Thanks for being here. From Crescent Petroleum, we're joined by the CEO, Majid Jafar. I'm delighted that he's here. The executive chairman of the board from Tellurian is also with us here, Charif Souki. And also I'm joined with the CEO from GE Gas Power, Scott Strazik. So that's our great team here. And I'd like to actually start with you, Scott, if I may, because I was reading with some fascination your white paper that you just recently put out. So I think this will give us perhaps a little bit of an overview in where you see gas at the moment and the role that it will play in mitigating climate initiatives here to and actually really helping as we go forward, particularly into maybe a longer future. What do you
Sure,
think?
I'd love to start. Eithne, thank you. I mean, at the beginning, clearly from a GE perspective, we play in many technologies in the energy space and have studied this very acutely. And as much as it's very clear that renewables is going to drive most of the new capacity additions in the power sector, there's going to be a critical role for gas to play in this transition. And that role is going to evolve over time. In this next decade, we're very much talking about a decade of action. How do we decarbonize the existing power space as effectively as possible, in which coal to gas switching is going to play a very material part in that transition? I mean, gas existing install base relative to an average coal plant is half the carbon emissions. Just that shift can have a dramatic impact. And we've seen that in the US because our carbon emissions in the US, although power demand has been reasonably flat over the last decade, emissions have come down by about a third, primarily with coal to gas switching. And the US benefit in that regard because of shale gas is going to become much more available to the rest of the world as LNG supply grows. And places that not only care about the carbon, but also care about the power density of gas in parts of the world, especially in Asia, where they're going to need to produce a lot of power in a small footprint. So this decade may be very focused on that, while at the same time, a lot of fast charging power aeroderivatives to support intermittent renewables with a longer term pathway to zero carbon with gas, whether that be through hydrogen or through carbon capture. And that will be an evolution, but we can't just focus on a net zero end state. We need to also focus on a decade of action now that buys the world more time. And gas can help decarbonize that world, especially with coal to gas switching. And that's a lot of what our white paper talks about.
And there's many elements of it too we'll pick up on, as we go through the conversation, because I think it relates to what many other people want to talk about as well. Fatima, if I may bring you in at this point, and when we look at, gas and LNG particularly here, how would you say that, people and companies can actually, make their products more competitive and possibly more acceptable when it comes to decarbonization?
Hi, Eithne. I'm happy to be again part of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum. We definitely seen the momentum increase recently when it comes to net zero and the decarbonization of all fuels. And we've always looked at natural gas and LNG as part of the solution. And Scott here just gave an example, and the US is the most recent, but we've seen this as well in China. We've seen it before in the UK. As the role of gas is more visible in the energy mix, we see how this impacts the emissions and the carbon footprint. But clearly, when we are talking about a net zero, 50% lower is not good enough. So there is more that needs to be done. And I would like to summarize it in 3 points mainly. First of all, as producers, as well as the consumers, we are looking at the whole value chain here. we need to make sure that our operations are as efficient as possible when it comes to the emissions that we emit to the atmosphere. And this has been also one of our main focuses here in ADNOC. As some of you have heard, we've announced that we need to reduce our GHG emissions intensity by 25% in 2030. And if I talk specifically about ADNOC LNG, we are translating this into actionable projects that are part of our plans. The second point is carbon capture. And the third is, of course, offsetting the impact. And I was just doing a quick back of the envelope calculation just now with my 10 years old daughter. So if we assume that a cargo of LNG needs to offset its impact, we need to plant something like 240,000 trees. To just offset the whole effect, we need to plant trees equal to those in Switzerland multiplied by 3 just for 1 year. So clearly there is it's not one or the other, it's all of the above that needs to be done in order for us to really make and continue having gas as a competitive fuel. And really this is going to differentiate the producers as we move on.
Yes, indeed, there's so many elements that we really have to take into consideration. It's got to be competitive, it's got to be available, clean, safe, affordable, all of that. So it's got to tick all of these boxes, and that will actually then ensure its longevity. Sheikh Nawaf, if I could come to you on that sort of issue in many ways too, and we've heard a lot over recent years, in fact, in terms of, you know, is gas just a transition fuel, or can it actually be a permanent component, you know, of the future energy mix? What do you think?
Well, the problem with making gas a transition fuel, it needs to be a transition to something else. The issue then becomes, what is that something else? Right now, if you're talking about solar, wind, photovoltaic, solar, it's growing about 13% a year. It's probably, according to the IEA, is going to take up about a third of new energy, new electricity demand. But where's the other 2/3 going to come from? Well, there's not enough alternatives right now, and I'm not using the term alternatives to mean the alternative fuels, but actually alternatives to gas for power generation that make more sense. As a first step, and Scott was certainly mentioning this earlier, switching from coal to gas makes a lot of sense from a carbon perspective. And that is why the UK now has gone back to essentially pre-industrial levels of carbon emissions just by phasing out coal plants in the United Kingdom. If the world starts doing that, that is a huge step towards lowering carbon emissions, but it won't get you to net zero. Another step, however, is going to have to be dealt with in China. The greatest increase in electricity demand is China. They're about somewhere between a quarter to a third of electricity demand in the world right now, just because of the factories and the economic activity that's going on. However, it's still about 2 to 3 new coal plants per week coming on stream in China. How do you control for that? How do you build a capacity of energy, electricity through alternatives to hydrocarbons or even carbon that will get you to net zero? I'm really having a trouble finding how the mathematics work towards achieving net zero without a significant change in economic activity in the world, and frankly, a lower standard of living. So what my point here is that in any mix of energy in the future, hydrocarbons gas for electricity, oil for transportation, will certainly play a part. It will be a different part over time, but there will certainly be a role. And for gas, your question was about a transition. Yes, over the next period, certainly as China, South Korea, and Japan, which constitute a huge portion of gas demand, if they start moving towards their targets, there will be an increase in LNG demand in Asia and those countries specifically before it actually ever dissipates over time to try to reach the net zero policy. So if you're trying to reach near zero, you will have an increase in gas demand over time before theoretically you have then a decrease, which I'm still questioning at this point.
Yes, indeed. Getting the metrics around there is, it's challenging to say the least. But Majid, what is also challenging, of course, is, I guess, it's a challenge out there for the industry to actually get to net zero. When we look at the advantages of natural gas, I think we can see right now it's absolute necessity. But where would you say are the big advantages that will actually perhaps build in more sustainability for gas?
So I think, first of all, I agree very much with everything that's been said already. I do think the climate change challenge is fundamentally how do we wean Asia off coal, because that's where the growth is. We've got 80% of the world's current coal consumption in Asia. China alone is half the world's, and India another 15%. So everything that's done in Europe or the US isn't really going to matter if that trend continues with the 2 or 3 power plants a week that we heard about. And so gas will play a key role as an enabler of renewables. It's a necessary complement. And the UAE energy policy for 2050 has exactly that balance between around 40% of natural gas and 40% of renewables. And I do think it's unhelpful, the whole fossil fuels versus renewables mindset that people have out there in the public. We need to break away from that. Oil is about transportation and making stuff, and very important stuff, including masks and sanitizers and vaccines and medicines and all the stuff we've come to rely on. Gas is a power fuel, and it needs to be looked at, and it's actually gas replacing coal that's had 100 times bigger impact on reducing CO2 emissions in the last 10 years than all the electric vehicles in the world. But we don't get the credit as an industry. We do need to measure and improve our operations in terms of methane leakage, in terms of flaring. I mean, we as Crescent Petroleum, we're now 85% natural gas. We've cut our carbon intensity to 1/3 of the industry average, our flaring down to 0.7% and trying to push that further. So I think all of that is going to be important for our industry, but in parallel, we do need to advocate for the industry. Wood Mackenzie's estimated we need $2 trillion of investment in the industry between now and 2040. The concern is that those sources of financing and investment are starting to dry up because somehow we've been put in this bucket as not part of the solution. And until the technologies of storage and hydrogen and carbon capture get cracked, and none of them have been at scale yet, let's admit it, gas will be absolutely a necessary complement and a destination, not just a transition.
Thank you. Charif, when we look at demand, and Shaikh Nawaf just mentioned it there too, but let's have a look at what I would say the potential growth of energy consumption on a global basis. We talk about bringing people out of poverty by 2030, 2050, as soon as possible. And I think the responsibility in the world to actually do that. So surely the growth in demand, and also we look at emerging economies as well, this has got to be high, and gas is going to play a very strong role there. Talk to me about that, and also in terms of what those figures coming out of the International Energy Agency are looking like, perhaps.
Well, let's put things in perspective to start with. We today consume on a global basis 300 million barrels of oil equivalent. Of that, 100 million roughly is oil, 65 million roughly is gas, 70 million roughly is coal, and renewables is 11 million. So and the rest is nuclear. So we have to choose what is the mix that we're looking for. But before we do that, we have to agree on what is the growth rate going to be. So I was a little surprised by the IEA numbers showing that the growth rate is going to be 1%, but even that over 30 years is a 50% increase in energy consumption. I'd be surprised to see developing countries around the world agreeing to that kind of modest growth rate. That will only materialize if prices have gone to a level that actually deter from energy consumption. But energy consumption is very much correlated to growth of the economy. And I don't think anybody is going to gladly embrace this if you're trying to take your population out of poverty and into the middle class. But after that, you have to choose your energy mix. And if you don't want to increase oil and you want to reduce coal, you don't want to talk about nuclear, you're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on renewables and natural gas. You can make whatever assumption you want on the growth of renewable, and that has its own limitations. But let's accept whatever number you want to pick. It is going to still leave an enormous amount that is going to be incumbent on gas. I'm not sure we can do it. I will add one thing. There's a trend to electrification today. So Tesla sells 500,000 cars and has a valuation of about $1 trillion, almost. That means that their access to capital is enormous. But if you believe the electrification and you believe EVs are the future, the implication on the power generation necessary in order to support this kind of growth for EVs is mind-boggling. So I'll take an easy example here in the United States. The governor of California has decreed that we are going to eliminate the combustion engine in California by the year 2035. That would require 100 gigawatts of additional power generation capacity. That's a doubling of the existing capacity in California. So it's nice to say this, but California is not going to put nuclear. They're not going to agree to coal. I'm not quite sure. I mean, if you really start thinking in terms of the number of solar panels and the number of windmills they would have to put in California to justify this kind of growth in energy consumption, it would be mind-boggling. So we have to stop confusing aspirations with practicality. There are certain steps you can take that are necessary. I think it's a big mistake to underestimate the appetite of the developing world for energy consumption. And there are certain things you can do. Put a price on carbon, absolutely. Encourage, as Fatima was saying, reforestation. Even though it's daunting, 250,000 per cargo, maybe we can do a little bit better and plant more trees. But somewhere I've read that we need 1 trillion trees to get to net zero. Well, let's get started.
Yes,
because
indeed.
I don't know.
Let's hold some of the solutions for another conversation. Hold that if I can.
Please.
Yeah, Majid, I want to bring you in on this because I know it's an area that you're very passionate to about the growth agenda. And when we look in the West, actually, a lot of people calling for a complete overhaul of the energy system. And there's a sense of impatience around. But can the world actually pursue economic growth while at the same time really achieve the net zero ambitions? Majid, what do you think?
So I think, I totally agree with what Charif said. I think part of the problem, if you look at the UN SDGs, and I think they're an excellent list, for most developed countries, the only one that really matters is climate change. The rest are not an issue. But for most of the developing world, health, education, poverty, all of them are an issue. And energy access is actually a number 8, I think, before climate change. We still have 1 billion people almost with no electricity, 3 billion people with no clean cooking, relying on wood and coal. And so absolutely the developing world is where the growth is. And it cannot be a Western message that, sorry, you are not allowed to have our standards of living. I mean, that kind of hypocrisy won't fly. That will be seen as a neo-colonialism. And it can't just be, sorry, you're not allowed to expect grid, reliable grid power, have a solar panel and a battery and that'll be you done. It's not gonna work. And we haven't even, we're still really focused on Asia now. Africa is coming. So it does need to absolutely take into account the needs of the developing countries. And I, for one, think that the developed countries will have to pay for it, not just lecture about it. There's no point spending €1 trillion in Europe when the demand growth is in Asia. It's like rearranging the furniture in the bedroom when the living room's on fire.
Yeah, I mean, what a good put it. Yes, it's very clear for us all to see that. Scott, if I can bring you back in here, and in your report also about addressing climate change must be an urgent global priority requiring global action, national commitments, consistent policy, regulatory frameworks. But then you also say you believe that decarbonization actions will be determined locally based on current structure and demand. I mean, it has to run in tandem, do you think, to make sure that it all rise together?
Very much, and I think I just would reinforce in that theme a lot of what everyone is saying, in the sense that in a developing world without access to reliable electricity, it's really hard to set the bar that they're going to be decarbonizing their economy today for the hypocrisy reasons framed here. Now, in parts of the world that have excess power and still availability of more space, more coal, there's an ability for developed parts of the world to massively decarbonize, as the US has been doing. But there also are going to be parts of the world that are going to gravitate towards the median and that don't have the optionality for renewables because things like power density are just so critical for them to deliver the electricity that's needed, that this is going to be a very local solution. And I think we have to look at a heat map, so to speak, of what every local place has available, leverage that to gravitate towards a more electrified world while decarbonizing with intensity, but realizing that different places have different resource capability, and we need to balance that while getting people access to a quality of life that we all can stand for.
Fatima, I mean, a lot of companies are, really putting action in place. They're making commitments, they're taking action. And we've seen, a lot announcing the first green LNG cargoes. This hopefully setting the standard for the future. But again, I mean, how quickly can LNG cargoes turn green? And there's going to be a cost associated with this. How do you see this playing out?
So we've heard about the green cargoes. Yet what happened in the market is just handful of deals and cargoes. And if we want to reach there, then we to make it something sustainable, a lot of work needs to be done. And many questions need to be answered. The first is around the transparency of such green cargoes and having clear definitions and measurements of the emissions through the value chain of LNG or gas. And even when we're talking about accredited, for example, offsets. Now, the other part of your question around who pays for it, I think so far we've seen producers pay for it, and for this to happen in a sustainable manner, I'm not really sure. I would be happy to hear what Charif thinks.
Well, I'll bring it back to him. In fact, Charif, why don't you come in on this one? Yes, in terms of who pays for it. And also, I suppose, when we look at, you're looking at that demand picture and looking at the cost and the volatility that we're likely to see in the coming years?
Well, ultimately, it's always the consumer that pays for it. One way or the other, because if you increase the price of the commodity, all that's going to happen, it's going to be more expensive for people who need it and use it. So it's absolutely true that in the West, we can probably save a lot because we can do a lot to our grids, we can do a lot to our buildings, we can do a lot to our cars. Yeah, we have the ability, but we are only 10% of the world's population. The other 90% needs to get out of, I was going to use a bad word, but the hole that they're in, you can imagine what I was thinking in terms of the prefix to the hole. And they want to get into the same living standards as what we have in Europe and in the United States. And when you know that this winter, France reintroduced some coal plants in order to avoid blackouts, that Germany continues to burn lignite, that in the United States, because gas prices have gone up by 60-70% in the last 6 months, is going to have an impact, unless we do something about it, on a resurgence of coal generated electricity, and with that, an increase in our emission standards. All these things, I mean, it's nice to have good intentions, but at the end of the day, the practicality is not translated. We talk, but the actions are not exactly what we're looking for. So I would step back and say, okay, we need to do some things that are practical, that address the problem immediately. But if not, the answer to your question is the consumer is going to pay. And if it happens to be the consumer in India or in China, it's going to be catastrophic for them.
Scott, if I can bring you in here, and another part of your report very clearly says, it obviously, gives us the figures here in terms of coal, the largest fuel source for electricity generation still in the world today, accounting for 37% of the total, just as Charif is saying there. And despite massive renewable investment, coal generation down only 10%. Good for gas, it's up 33%. But again, there's a lot of work to do here. And how does the industry begin to sort of, fill those gaps?
I mean, that is the challenge, and it also is a capital challenge. I mean, every $200 billion that we're spending is just increasing renewables penetration by about 1% a year. And that is going to take a really long time to solve this problem in a world that also post a pandemic has budget challenges at play also. So it comes down to how do we move the needle quickly at scale. Coal to gas can do that. It also is exponentially more capital efficient in a world where that's going to be a big part of this equation as we try to gravitate the world towards a better standard of living. So again, this is a very local challenge in different places. It's a lot why in our white paper and the podcast we're launching that people can see on ge.com, we're talking about a decade of action. It doesn't mean we're not talking about 2050 and net zero. There are technologies that will continue to advance over the next 3 decades that we're not talking about, but there's a lot we can do now. And in that period of time, let's do it to buy ourselves some more time. And that's a lot of what we're framing up in the white paper.
And indeed, yes, when we look at the headlines, we would think that the figures were healthier than that. But I mean, it's the harsh reality of the way things are. Sheikh Nawaf, when coal to gas clearly is something I think that needs to happen. We want to see it happen. But how might natural gas displace oil demand and actually oil production, of course? And what is this going to mean for, yourself in Kuwait, indeed, and all of the GCC producers?
Sure. The gas demand will continue to grow, as we were saying, but it still will not replace oil demand completely. Oil demand still remains the transportation fuel. You still have a lot of oil demand that is not combusted. It is generated into petrochemicals and other products. So as we look to the future, looking at even at the oil side of the business, you have a market that was pre-pandemic about 100 million barrels a day. It's probably around 90 or so now. But in any scenario, oil demand will continue to increase at least for the next 10 and 20 years. But if you have less investment in supply, then you will have an issue over supply and having enough supply to meet that demand, even if it is decreased. Take 10, 20, 30 million barrels off the oil demand picture. That is the decline rates of existing fields will more than offset that. So you will have to have additional investment. Same holds true for gas as we move forward. At KUFPEC, we're doing this, and from a Kuwaiti perspective, we're doing this. Actually, we're both on both sides of this equation. Kuwait is an importer of LNG. At KUFPEC, we LNG. We produce gas and oil out around the world. In fact, speaking about the LNG market today, with the overheated market, I sold a cargo of LNG today, which came in at a price, let's say, much higher than we originally budgeted for this year. So that was actually quite good. But the issue then becomes, how do we put gas and oil into this energy mix and ensure that we have the ability to meet the energy demands in the future? For example, on the downstream side of our business, the Kuwait service stations that we have throughout Europe, especially Northwest Europe, we are electrifying quite a bit of the offerings that we have at those stations. It's not because we're trying to cannibalize the gasoline and diesel demand that we see at our service stations, but it's also because fleet customers are demanding that we have a full service of options available. So the point of that is that while government subsidies and government regulation may drive demand for electrification of vehicle fleet, for example, and other types of uses, it's not until consumer demand really takes charge that it makes a difference. Because we all have seen the statistics. Norway, which has massive subsidies for electric vehicles, it doesn't even make sense to buy an internal combustion engine in Norway because of the subsidies that you get from buying an electric vehicle. That's why Norway had for the first time last year, more electric vehicles sold than ICE engine in Norway. Take away that subsidy, and we've had it taken away in other places around the world. Take that away, you immediately see a drop in EV sales. And as Scott was mentioning, with countries, almost every country around the world right now, printing money, just trying to figure out how to keep their economies afloat in a pandemic, there's going to be no budget left over to pay for the types of subsidies that you're going to need. So it's going to have to be more consumer demand driven, and unless you can offer an economic solution that meets consumer demand and is competitive against hydrocarbons, you're not going to see a fundamental change that will last.
Yeah, I mean, so much needs to be done there, and it's something, again, will be at a different stage, different countries. Majid, come in here. We had been talking earlier too, and as you said, that the Middle East almost found gas by mistake when he was looking for oil. But perhaps in this region, as you say too, is there more growth for gas, more development for gas? I mean, is this just a good time to be looking at the gas market here in the Middle East, because it's really not reached its maturity yet, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, our region has 40% of the world's proven natural gas reserves. But as you said, most of that was discovered looking for oil. And it's only really in the last few years, the last 5 to 10 years, that gas has become a target for exploration and development here in our region in a major way, driven by the rapid growth in power demand and also for industry and population growth. What we really need, I think, to improve that development, accelerate it in our region, is the right regulations to encourage investments in different part of the value chain, because gas is obviously not like oil, not fungible. You can't store it and ship it as easily without LNG infrastructure or pipeline. So we really need the right regulations to encourage investment and in private sector investment, not just relying on state budgets in every element of the chain, as well as clear and transparent pricing, in the upstream, and that will also require reform of subsidies downstream, particularly electricity subsidies, which is starting to happen, but still has further to go. And I think, worldwide, the three things that the gas needs to get a push, and in many developing countries, it's air quality that's leading to a push for gas in China and India, for example. But the first is, let's be honest, that 100% renewables today won't work, and for the foreseeable future, and therefore there will be an important role for gas and power. And that message really needs to be clear for the development banks and some of the private banks who are turning their back on quote unquote fossil fuels. And when they do that and refuse to invest in gas in developing countries, you will have more burning of coal, and you will have more CO2 emissions, and it'll be self-defeating. The second one that would help, Charif mentioned and others, a carbon price would help bridge that gap, because in many of these developing countries, without that, coal will continue to be more competitive. And the third, I think, is trade wars are not helpful. If these countries don't have large enough domestic resources of natural gas, as in the case in China, for example, or in India, and trade wars cause concern over security of supply, that will put a dent in the growth. So I think those three things would go a big way, particularly in developing countries, in ensuring the coal to gas switch that complements renewable growth.
And that has to be really looked at and paid attention to, without a doubt. Now, we're more than halfway through our panel, and I haven't mentioned the H word yet. So Fatima, come talk to me a little bit about this. And I know a few of you I want to engage on it. And indeed, a big congratulations to Abu Dhabi, to ADNOC too, and the work that they're doing in and the recent deal that you put in place there. Do you think that hydrogen and natural gas will actually, complement each other, and that hydrogen is indeed, the new future in the industry? And Fatima, we've got you on mute. Aha.
Okay, so I don't know why whenever there is a new kid in the block, it's natural gas that is always doubted that will exit the scene. Definitely, hydrogen is a promising carrier for energy. And as you just mentioned, and as expected, in Abu Dhabi, we always invest today for the future. We have, of course, a competitive advantage. We've built some experience when it comes to elements that are required for the hydrogen industry to pick up. We have the natural gas as a resource for a blue hydrogen, as I said, carbon capture. We've got the experience in this. We have also Masdar, which is a pioneer in the region when it comes to solar and renewable. So I think we're positioned well in the region to lead when it comes to hydrogen development. And in the contrary, I don't think it's going to push gas back. I think gas is required for hydrogen to pick up, because blue hydrogen seems to be at least the starting point. And I believe there are going to be many partnerships and developments for the future. But as I said, this is an investment we make today for the future, and we have to worry about today as well. So reality remains, as everybody in this panel just mentioned, reality remains that today we have almost 9 in 10 people do not have, 1 in 9 people do not have access to energy. And you can just imagine how much potential this is holding back. We all know that the Asia, which is the biggest consumer as well, they have almost 50% of their energy coming from coal. So I believe there is still potential for gas to remain, and I've heard it, I think, and the audience heard it enough today in this panel, repeated by each of us. But I want to refer to something I've heard yesterday or the day before during His Excellency Dr. Sultan's conversation with Amos. There is no solution that fits all. The energy mix equation is not an easy one, and it's not one line that we have to draw across every country and every region and every economy. What's affordable here is not affordable there. What's possible here is not possible there. And as energy suppliers, we need to provide options and contribute to this potential of growth.
Thank you. Scott, talk to me about where GE Power sees hydrogen at the moment and the future of it, the strength that you think is there.
Sure. I think from a technology perspective with gas turbines, the capability to burn hydrogen exists today. I mean, our gas turbine fleet has over 6 million operating hours of some blend of hydrogen. In our most advanced HA technology with new power plants we're building, the first HA plant that'll run on a blend of hydrogen will be in November of 21 this year. So the technology's there. It's just a matter of the economics of the fuel advancing to a point that it makes sense at scale. And that's going to take time without question. And it's also to the point it's going to be from a combination of blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, many variables at play that get us there. But we also talk about the fact that we have been wrong over the last 20 years for how quickly solar and wind costs will come down. Hydrogen costs are going to come down also through innovation, and it's going to play a role, but that's a role that's going to take time. And we don't want to just wait for the perfect solution. We want to use the technology we have now, address the problem to the best capability that we have, while keeping an eye to tomorrow, in which hydrogen's going to play a role, but let's just not wait for tomorrow. Let's act now, and a decade of action today.
And I think, at least people are talking about different colors on hydrogen and not getting so caught up in terms of that there's only one and it has to be green. But Charif, talk to me now in terms of, do we need hydrogen? It sounds like it's really expensive. It sounds like it's in the future. I mean, do we have the time to wait? And when we look at the technology that's out there and the technology that we can and should deploy, and we've been talking about some of it in terms of CCSU for a while, is that where do you see this? Where do you see the future for hydrogen?
Well, I agree with Scott that we always underestimate the speed at which technology improves. That for me is you can take for granted. So it will become affordable. There is one issue that you can't get around. It's the bottom C part of the molecule. I mean, it comes from CH4. It's wonderful to get the 4 H's, but you got to do something with the C. And in Fatima's case, it's easy. They have depleted reservoirs. They can go stick it in the ground. Other places, it's not that obvious. So until you resolve the issue of what you're going to do with the carbon molecule and isolate it and stick it in the ground somewhere and build the infrastructure to do that, it's going to be a very small solution to the rest of the energy mix. If you don't have a depleted reservoir, there's nothing you can do with the C molecule. You can do a little bit of industrial manufacturing, yes. But then, in the United States, if you wanted to do a hydrogen plant in New Mexico, stick it in some depleted reservoirs over there, and then send the hydrogen to California, that would work. But you can't find a lot of situations like this. So the issue is going to be, what do you do with the carbon? And the infrastructure you would have to build in order to get rid of the carbon at the moment is prohibitively expensive.
So there's still a lot of work to be done on that, and maybe in the meantime, gas is probably still the best answer. Natural gas, as we know it, is providing like a lot of answers right now. Sheikh Nawaf, talk to me a little bit about your recent project in Malaysia that you have announced to. And while we're not looking at hydrogen at all for Kuwait right now, we're certainly, as you said, looking at carbon capture on that. And also, but you're making sure that you're going to bring clean gas from this. How are you actually going to do that?
Sure. Our gas portfolio has grown over the past few years. In addition to the Wheatstone LNG project that we're in Australia, that is one of the most efficient producers of LNG from a carbon perspective. We announced last year the discovery of a multi-TCF gas field offshore Malaysia. We're in the process of doing the appraisal drilling right now, and all indications are that it will be quite significantly more and larger than what we even initially expected and announced last year. So, in the interest of making some news today, that is something that is quite large, and it's probably along the lines of one of the top finds over the past couple of years. But again, it's gas, and it needs to be monetized and extracted in an environmentally friendly way. And one of the things we're working on is looking at how do we capture the carbon and utilize it and sequester it. So under the CCUS standards, we're looking at what's the best way that we can use to essentially sequester the carbon out of the production, and then use that technology and use that knowledge to bring in our sister companies here in Kuwait, all part of the KPC group family of companies, to bring in that type of knowledge to Kuwait, because while Kuwaiti production of oil lies at the low end of the cost curve from a dollar perspective, it also actually lies on the low end and the left end of the carbon curve. So we are still one of the lowest carbon cost producers of hydrocarbons in the world, but we want to be even better. We recognize that in the future, if oil demand changes over time, we will still be producing, because we lie on the low end of both of those curves that I just mentioned. But it requires development of really effective CCUS, how to use that carbon, not only just to sequester it, but even better, to use that to replace gas as an injection molecule into a reservoir, into an underground oil reservoir, to maintain reservoir pressure and stimulate production. Right now, the international community uses gas, uses water. Both of them are expensive, and if we can replace that effectively with carbon to inject into not just into an underground cavern and to sit there do nothing, but instead into an oil field and an oil reservoir to stimulate that production, then that solves two issues in one action. And it is being done right now. Technologically, it is possible, but it's not very efficient, and it is quite expensive, something around the lines of $30 to $35 per barrel to do that. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense anytime soon, but as my co-panelists were saying, don't underestimate how technology will drive the costs lower, and we're trying to work towards driving that cost lower so that we can do essentially two things at once.
Now, I've only got about a minute left for each one of you, and some fascinating discussion here. Majid, if in sort of wrapping up, you can combine a few things perhaps together with us in a question here from Stephen Green, and just following on from what Sheikh Nawaf was just saying there. I mean, it's expensive, and this is investment, and technology is absolutely essential. And we also look at the banks really paying attention to ESG, all of this in place here. But, once these new generation assets are put in place, how can, this is coming from Stephen Green, we prepare to decarbonize them in the future? And what commitments, are the industry making to make sure that they can do it? Are you happy there's enough commitments there?
So I think, the risk we have is year after year, there's a new buzzword or new, that everybody's talking about every year. And they're all great, but they all require a lot of investment and a lot of time to be able to scale. And there are limits to where the cost will go down. There's unfortunately out there thinking that energy is the same as mobile telephony or computing, and you've got some Moore's law and the cost reductions will be infinite and endless. That's not the case. We're getting close to limits when it comes to solar and wind. So the takeaway I have, it's absolutely important to make those investments for the long term, but we need to take steps right now to prevent the growth of emissions that's still happening this year, despite the pandemic in Asia because of coal. And natural gas is the obvious way to do that, but the world has to take certain steps to make sure that happens, because at the moment there's underinvestment and it won't happen.
Fatima, I'll combine this too for your closing remarks with a question, and this too from Salma Al-Wardani, particularly with LNG and operations. Where do you see the demand growth for LNG happening mainly? And, how is ADNOC benefiting from the boom on spot prices at the moment?
So LNG, in all scenarios, even the scenarios that is the most optimistic when it comes to renewables, you still see growth happening in gas, and more specifically when it comes to LNG. LNG has this advantage, and especially now with the FSRUs, making it accessible to countries that were not part of the list of importing countries, and that club is growing day by day. So the potential is really great, and as we've heard multiple times, the benefits are there and available now immediately, and you can sense them and feel them as soon as you integrate gas and LNG into your energy mix.
Thank you. Charif, when we look at, we've got about a minute each for the last three speakers. What do we need to do? What does the industry need to do now to sort of future-proof it in many ways?
Unfortunately, Eithne, all we need to do is be patient, because nobody listens to a preacher. Everybody listens to somebody who hits them on the head with a stick. So, and the stick is going to be the pricing. Today, future prices for 2021 in Europe are slightly north of $6, and future prices in Asia, in spite of what just happened, on average is $9. That is not sufficient to justify the construction of new LNG facilities around the world or new pipelines. My fear is for the next several decades, given that we need to increase 150 million barrels equivalent, we don't want to think about anything else except renewables, we're going to have a serious short, and we're going to have a serious price reaction. We will not have enough gas to deliver what is required of us.
And nobody wants to see that situation. Yes, the picture on that, we're going to have a worse turnaround. Well, I got to wrap you up on this one. Forgive me. We're going to be watching what you talk about and what you write about in the next while, and listening very careful. Nawaf, just a closing word from you in terms of the future for gas and its role in terms of net zero. Are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic for the role that gas is going to play. I think one of the things that we have to watch out for in the future is there going to be a decoupling of the gas price and the gas market from economic activity? I mean, typically, from the oil market, you see it follows economic activity. Right now, you're starting to see potential decoupling of gas from oil prices, and then also the question then becomes, are we going to decouple that from economic activity so that even if the world economy moves and continues to expand, is there going to be gas demand that will be decreasing? I think no. I think the answer is, at least for the interim period, the middle period, 10 years or so, 10 or 20 years, you'll find that gas demand will continue to increase. One of the points that Charif was making, for example, is right now, if everybody in the world moves towards a per capita usage of electricity and gas, as in Europe and the EU, that will entail an increase of 50% above today's electricity demand.
So a lot to play for here. I need to give this last minute to Scott. Round it off for us, Scott.
I just say GE's been a leader in the electricity space for over 100 years. We've played in coal, gas, nuclear. Today, we have a big wind business we're committed to, onshore and offshore. We make inverters for solar panels. We believe that the climate crisis is real, but gas is going to play a critical role in this along with wind and solar, and we're investing heavily in our gas business because of a lot of what we've talked about in the last hour. So it's going to take a lot of answers. Gas with renewables is going to be a key complement in that, and I appreciate being part of this discussion with my co-panelists.
Well, super, and thank you all so much. And they're going to be very thrilled with us that we came in right on time too. So I was, we never promised complete answers to everybody out there, but I really want to thank you for your great expertise and your input. Fatima, Sheikh Nawaf, Majid, Charif, and Scott, thank you all so much for being part of it.